It was 1915, and the world was immersed in one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. As massive armies clashed in France and Russia, the fighting forces dug into fortified trenches in a desperate attempt to cripple the enemy's onslaught. As the months dragged on, and the unparalleled stalemate seemed to have no end, the Allied forces looked to the distant Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally, as a possible target to weaken Germany's supply lines and manpower. Thus, Britain planned to use its almighty navy to invade the Gallipoli peninsula and rain fire over Constantinople, forcing it to surrender in just a couple of weeks. If the scheme worked, Germany would be cut off from supplies, and the Allies would be able to support Russia through the Dardanelles Strait. Thousands of British, Australian, New Zealand, and Indian troops then stormed the beaches of the Ottoman Peninsula on April 25th. But what was meant to be a simple operation against one of the weakest armies in Europe quickly became a crushing defeat for the British forces and a nightmare for a young Winston Churchill. It would take cunning wits and remarkable bravery if the Allies wanted to come out alive. Allies divided. As trench warfare became the new normal in World War I, members of the Triple Entente found themselves divided into two ideological groups, the Easterners and the Westerners. The Westerners recognized that the real threat was Germany and wanted all resources and efforts concentrated on the Western Front to break the stalemate and push the German troops back into Berlin. Meanwhile, the Easterners considered that throwing more troops into the Western battlefront would lead to more unnecessary losses. In their opinion, resources should instead be employed to break Germany's allies in the east and sever its supply lines. Russia could then be resupplied with heavy artillery through the area. The debate was heated, but the Easterners finally got their way, thanks in no small part to the support of the British First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, who was convinced the Navy would easily shred through the inferior Ottoman forces. At the time, the Ottoman Empire was considered the sick man of Europe due to its diminishing economy, its internal social unrest, and the recent military crushes it had suffered against Italy and the Balkan states. In addition, the Ottomans only had a few ships and no established naval doctrine. Defending a thin peninsula against the world's most powerful navy was considered simply impossible. Setting the stage. The British top brass was so confident in a quick and overwhelming victory that their first attempt didn't even consider the need for an army. The Navy would bomb the coastal guns in the peninsula, minesweepers would clear the Dardanelles Strait, and the massive warships would sail to Constantinople, where they would bomb it into submission. However, the British authorities completely downplayed the risk of the Ottomans' coastal guns and mobile artillery batteries located in the peninsula. On February 17, 1915, a British aircraft from HMS Ark Royal conducted a reconnaissance mission over the straits. 2 days later, a paramilitary naval bombardment on the Dardanelles began when a massive Anglo-French task force that included the British dreadnought HMS Queen Elizabeth commenced a long-range bombardment to disable the enemy guns before the leading fleet entered the strait towards the Ottoman capital. The plan was to use 8 aircraft from Ark Royal to identify the artillery guns' locations for accurate bombardment. Still, severe weather conditions rendered all but one of the warplanes, a short Type 136, unusable. By February 25th, the outer forts had been destroyed, and the entrance was cleared of mines by a small group of civilian fishing ships used as minesweepers. However, the mobile field cannons remained elusive, constantly moving, making their neutralization impossible and risking the mines' removal from within the strait. A frustrated Churchill then increased the pressure on Naval Commander Admiral Sackville Carden, asking him to take action immediately. Carden responded by assuring Churchill that his fleet would arrive at Istanbul within 14 days to begin the city's bombardment. Victory seemed imminent, especially after the British intercepted a German message revealing that Ottoman forts in the peninsula were running low on ammunition. Motivated by the excellent news, Carden set the day of the main attack for March 17th. However, a few days later, the pressure took a toll on him, and he was replaced by Admiral John de Roebuck. Naval disaster. On March 18th, the entire fleet advanced towards the strait, spearheaded by the civilian minesweepers tasked with clearing the way. Most of the vessels were old warships deemed unfit to fight the German Navy. Still, they were regarded as more than capable enough to destroy the weak Ottoman forces. As the ships entered a mile-wide section of the strait, the fleet was about to pay for their overconfidence. The debacle began with the French battleship Bouvet striking a mine, causing her to capsize in less than 2 minutes and taking most of her crew with her. The civilian-manned minesweepers quickly retreated before the unrelenting Ottoman artillery fire, leaving the minefields mostly intact. HMS Irresistible and HMS Inflexible struck some of the mines, and Irresistible was immediately sunk, while Inflexible was severely damaged and forced to withdraw. HMS Ocean was sent to rescue Irresistible's crew, but was disabled by an artillery strike, struck a mine, and was evacuated, eventually sinking before reaching safety. Meanwhile, the French forces also took significant blows, with the battleships Suffren and Gaulois sailing through a new line of mines and getting severely damaged. A sense of chaos and confusion overwhelmed the Allies, as they were unsure where the destruction was coming from, and some of the captains feared being struck by German U-boats and their torpedoes. The mounting losses forced Admiral de Robeck to sound a general recall and retreat the entire fleet before being utterly destroyed. One thing was clear: the Gallipoli Peninsula could not be taken by the Navy alone. The army would have to disable the Ottoman artillery if they wanted to reach the enemy's capital. Preparations. Amphibious warfare doctrine was in its early stages during World War I, and the British forces were not adequately prepared to conduct such a massive landing operation. They lacked proper landing craft, and most troops had to move to the beachheads on wooden boats. The exposure to fierce enemy fire proved extremely damaging. In contrast to the invading troops, the Ottoman forces had many advantages. The territory, with its clearly defined high grounds, maze-like ridges, and small beachheads, was ideal for a defensive effort. In addition, the Ottomans had a pretty good idea of where the landings would take place, and were led by brilliant German strategists and remarkable Ottoman officers, including Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, whose leadership would prove vital in the Ottoman defense operations. Morale was also a significant advantage for the Ottomans. After crushing the Navy incursion into the strait, they realized the British could be defeated. Fighting on their own territory also infused them with a steel resolve they had not shown in recent conflicts. The Ottoman forces employed a German defensive tactic. The beaches would be lightly defended, with just the minimum troops needed to offer resistance and stall the invasion. At the same time, the bulk of the soldiers would dig deeper inland on high ground, awaiting the enemy's advances. Despite the initial humiliating defeat, the British remained overconfident and were convinced it would not take more than 50,000 men to secure the peninsula and rid it of Ottoman artillery weapons. Further consolidation increased the number to 75,000. The landings were scheduled for April 23rd, but had to be pushed to the 25th due to unfavorable weather conditions, giving the Ottomans more time to prepare and mobilize their artillery. On that date, the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force of 78,000 men, made up of soldiers from the Australian Imperial Force, the Australian and New Zealand troops that eventually formed into Anzac, and several British and French troops arrived off the shores of Gallipoli. The landings. Several beaches were selected as landing locations. The 29th Division was to land at Hels, on the tip of the Gallipoli Peninsula, and then advance to the forts at Kilit Bahir to disable the artillery in the town. With the 3rd Australian Infantry Brigade, the Anzacs were tasked with spearheading the main assault, after landing north of Gaba Tepe on the Aegean coast. From there, they could advance across the peninsula, cut off the Ottoman forces in Kilit Bahir, and halt reinforcements from reaching Cape Helles. The latter sector of the Gallipoli Peninsula became known as Anzac Cove, and the zone held by British and French troops became known simply as the Hells. Meanwhile, the French forces made a diversion attack, landing at Kumkale, before re-embarking to secure the eastern area of the Hells sector. Naval support was meant to be the main advantage of the Allied forces. Still, as the landings unfolded, it proved to be drastically ineffective. Most Ottoman artillery units were cleverly placed behind hills and ridges, and remained intact despite the Royal Navy's efforts to silence them. Due to questionable intelligence and unpredictable currents, the Anzac forces landed in a different position than where they intended. The beach was much smaller, and the terrain significantly harsher, making the landings very costly for the Allies. The new landing location was lightly defended, but due to the Ottomans' high ground position and the complexity of the terrain, they were able to hold back the Anzac force for several hours, but at a high cost. Anzac Cove. The Anzac troops were finally able to break through, but their complete ignorance of the region and the maze-like terrain forced them back into the beach as soon as Ottoman reinforcements pushed back. A lethal enemy counterattack would then pummel the Anzac forces, leading their commanders to consider re-embarking. However, at the last minute, it was decided they should dig in instead. A brutal war of attrition ensued, mirroring the trench warfare on the Western Front. During the following 4 months, the British would make several daring attempts to break the Ottoman defense, but they would be futile. Similarly, the Ottoman forces would repeatedly try to push the invaders back to the sea, but they would never accomplish it. By August, the Anzac forces made an aggressive push inland to capture Chinook Bayir and Hill 971, which would be the first step towards cutting Ottoman reinforcements from the northeast. The attack proved highly damaging to thousands of Australians and New Zealand soldiers, but they were able to capture the central Ottoman trench system and push the enemy inland. British commanders had realized that taking the peninsula was costing much more time, manpower, and supplies than they previously anticipated. If they wanted to win, they would have to capture Chinook Bayir and Hill 971 now. Displaying formidable bravery, the Anzac Corps continued advancing, but getting smaller by the minute. They then came within 500 meters of Chinook Bayir before being halted by enemy fire, but they were able to capture the hill after 2 days. Still, a surprising Ottoman counteroffensive would soon force them back. Withdrawal. The British leaders realized their only window for victory had closed and requested 150,000 additional soldiers. The petition was denied, as it would mean weakening the Western Front. Despite the hopelessness of the situation, Britain refused to withdraw, as it believed its reputation would be severely tarnished. The trench war continued for several months, during which the Allied soldiers perished in massive numbers due to dysentery and lack of fresh supplies. It would take the sudden addition of Bulgaria to the Central Powers for the British to finally order a retreat. With Bulgaria on Germany's side, the Ottomans had a direct bridge to the country, from where they could receive more artillery and support that would make the invasion impossible. Tacticians projected that evacuation would translate into a massacre, but in an incredible show of organization and determination, the British forces conducted a perfect retreat, displaying formidable tactical capabilities that had been absent earlier during the campaign. The Allies stopped firing during the nights for months before the retreat, so the Ottomans got used to idle nights. Meanwhile, the troops erected thousands of fake tents on the beaches and unloaded empty crates to fool the Ottomans into thinking the operations would continue. Anzac soldiers also invented a way to automatically trigger a rifle by using 2 tins, a piece of string, and some water. Then, in December, the troops began to retreat little by little under the cover of night, leaving their rifles to fire on their own. By the 20th, all the troops had left the northern beaches, and the Ottomans were none the wiser. The unique retreat was carried out with no losses in a flawless operation after an otherwise disastrous campaign that would become a humiliation for Britain and an unbearable blunder for Winston Churchill, who renounced his government position and enlisted in the armed forces to join the fight on the Western Front. Meanwhile, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk would become a hero and an iconic character in Ottoman history, who would soon be elected the first president of Turkey. Thank you for watching our video. Please let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels for more history-inspired content. Also, hit the bell icon to be notified of our newest videos. We publish new content every day.